My wife skipped my mother's funeral because our dog seemed sad. Here's everything that happened after. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's just call me Marcus. I'm 34. I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Denver, and up until about a year ago, I thought I had a pretty normal marriage. Not perfect, but normal. The kind where you assume the person you married would show up for the worst day of your life. I was wrong about that, and this is the long version of how I found out, what I did about it, and where I ended up. It's going to be a lot, so get comfortable. My mother, Eleanor, was 61 when she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She fought it for 8 months. And I mean fought. Chemo, a clinical trial in Boulder, the whole exhausting circus of hope and setback that anyone who's watched a parent go through this will recognize immediately. I drove up to see her every single weekend that I could, sometimes bringing my wife Vanessa, more often not, because Vanessa always had a thing. A brunch, a hot yoga class, a girls' trip to Scottsdale that had been booked for months and couldn't possibly be moved. I told myself that was fine. Everyone grieves differently. Everyone shows support differently. Not everyone needs to be in the room. I want to be honest that I made a lot of excuses for her long before the funeral, because in hindsight, the funeral wasn't really the beginning of the problem. It was just the moment the problem became impossible to ignore. My mom died on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was standing in the hallway outside her hospice room when the nurse came out and told me gently that she'd gone about 10 minutes earlier in her sleep without pain.
I hadn't made it in time by about 40 minutes. I'd been stuck in traffic on I-25, and that's a guilt I still carry, but the hospice nurse told me something that has stayed with me since. My mom's last coherent words the night before, spoken to the night shift aide, were that she was proud of the man her son had become. I've replayed that sentence in my head more times than I can count. I called Vanessa from the hospital parking lot. I was standing there in the cold with my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone, and I remember very specifically what she said when she picked up. Not, "I'm so sorry." Not, "Are you okay?" She said, "Wait, is this going to mess with my hair appointment Saturday?" I actually pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at it, like maybe I'd misheard her, like maybe there was some other explanation. There wasn't. The funeral was scheduled for that Saturday, the earliest the funeral home and the church could coordinate, and apparently that happened to be the same day as a highlight appointment she'd booked 6 weeks prior with a stylist named Brooke, who was, according to Vanessa, impossible to get in with on short notice. She did eventually reschedule the appointment. I'll give her that much. But she complained about the $40 rebooking fee for the better part of 3 days, bringing it up at dinner, bringing it up while we were picking out a tie for me to wear to the viewing, bringing it up in the car on the way to pick out flowers, like it was a wound she needed me to keep dressing for her. I remember standing in the florist with my mother's obituary photo tucked in my jacket pocket, picking out white lilies because those were her favorite, while my wife stood next to me sighing about Brooke's $40 cancellation policy. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't fight her on it in the moment because I was so hollowed out by grief that I genuinely didn't have the bandwidth to also manage her feelings about a hair appointment. That's a mistake I've thought about a lot since. Saturday morning arrived, cold and clear, one of those crisp Colorado fall mornings my mom always loved. I was in the bedroom putting on my suit, the black one I'd bought specifically for this because I didn't own a nice enough one, and Vanessa came in wearing sweatpants and a hoodie, not dressed at all, and told me she wasn't coming. I honestly thought she was joking at first. I laughed, this awful nervous laugh, and said something like, "Okay, very funny. Go get dressed. We need to leave in 20 minutes. She wasn't joking. She said our dog, a Pomeranian named Coco that she'd had since before we got married, had thrown up twice that morning and she was worried, and she couldn't in good conscience leave Coco alone in that state. I stood there in my half-buttoned dress shirt, trying to process what she was telling me. I explained as calmly as I possibly could, given that I was about to bury my mother, that dogs throw up sometimes, that it's usually nothing, that Coco had thrown up before after eating something off the sidewalk and been totally fine 2 hours later, that we could call the emergency vet line if she was really that worried, that my mother's funeral was happening exactly once, and Coco's stomach would almost certainly settle on its own. Vanessa's response was to accuse me of being cold and unfeeling, to tell me I clearly didn't understand what it meant to love an animal the way she loved Coco, and to say that my inability to empathize with her worry in that moment said something ugly about my character. I remember standing there thinking, distantly, almost like I was watching the scene from outside my own body, that this was one of the strangest arguments I had ever had with another human being. I left alone. I drove to the church alone, sat in the front pew alone, and stood at the door afterward greeting people alone. My mother's siblings, her book club friends of nearly 20 years, co-workers from the elementary school where she'd taught 3rd grade for 3 decades, my own aunts and uncles and cousins, people who had known her longer than I'd been alive. And over again, the same question, asked with the same kind, concerned confusion. Where's Vanessa? I must have answered that question 30 times that day, and every every single time I felt something in my chest curl up a little smaller. She's home. Our dog wasn't feeling well. I watch people's faces do this specific thing. A flicker of disbelief they tried to smooth over out of politeness, and I understood, watching those flickers, that I wasn't the only one who thought this was insane. My mother's younger sister, my Aunt Priscilla, pulled me aside near the guest book table, took both my hands in hers, and said, very quietly and very seriously, "Marcus, honey, I love you, and I'm not going to pretend I know your whole marriage. But any woman who skips her mother-in-law's funeral because of a dog with an upset stomach is not a woman worth staying married to. I need you to hear me say that." I didn't respond. I just nodded and let her hug me, and went back to shaking hands with people I hadn't seen in a decade, repeating my humiliating little script. That night, when I got home, the house was warm and smelled like the candle Vanessa always burns, and I found her on the couch under a blanket watching some reality show, a glass of white wine on the side table. Coco was not in any visible distress. Coco was, in fact, doing zoomies around the living room, chasing a squeaky toy, occasionally flopping onto her back, demanding belly rubs with the specific desperate energy of a dog who has never had a health problem in her life. I stood in the doorway in my black suit and just watched this scene for a solid 10 seconds before Vanessa noticed me and, without getting up, said, "You seem tense. Don't come in here being weird and passive-aggressive. I've had a really exhausting day. I basically don't leave the couch on high alert with a sick dog, and you're going to walk in here judging me?" I want to tell you, I had some kind of dramatic outburst in that moment. I didn't. I was too tired, too grief-scraped, too stunned by the sheer audacity of it. I said goodnight and went to sleep in the guest room, and I stayed in the guest room for a long time after that, though at first I told myself it was just because I needed space to grieve alone. Somewhere around week 3 of sleeping in the guest room, something shifted in me. I stopped being sad about the marriage and started being clear-eyed about it in a way I hadn't let myself be before. I started paying attention to a pattern I'd been actively looking away from for 3 years. Every instance where Vanessa had chosen convenience over presence, comfort over sacrifice, herself over literally anyone else, including me. I won't list every example because this story is already long, but once I started looking, I couldn't stop finding them. I quietly opened a separate checking account at a different bank than the one we shared, using my work address for the statements. I started researching divorce attorneys on my lunch break, reading reviews, taking notes. I pulled every financial document I could find: 3 years of joint statements, our mortgage paperwork, retirement account summaries, the deed to the house we'd bought together in Aurora, and organized it all into a folder I kept at the office, not at home. Vanessa didn't notice any of this. She really didn't. She was busy with her marketing job, busy with her hot yoga instructor certification she was pursuing for fun, busy with a rotating cast of brunches and happy hours with her friend group, busy with Coco's grooming appointments, which, incidentally, she never once missed or rescheduled. I existed in the house mostly as a kind of background utility during those 3 months, someone who paid half the bills and occasionally got asked to pick up dinner. She really did not notice that I had quietly begun building an exit. The moment that changed everything came about 3 months after the funeral, in late January. Vanessa's father, Harold, had a heart attack at his home in Columbus, Ohio, and needed emergency bypass surgery. Vanessa called me sobbing from her office, saying she'd already booked a flight for that evening, and she needed me to come with her, that she couldn't do this alone, that her father might die, and she needed her husband there. I remember standing in my own office, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something very cold and very calm settle over me. I told her I couldn't come, that I had some things I needed to take care of. She started crying harder, asking how I could possibly be so heartless, how I could let her go through something this terrifying by herself. Didn't I understand her father might not survive the surgery? And I said, and I remember this so clearly because it was the first time in 3 months I'd said anything to her about that day out loud. "You skipped my mother's funeral because our dog threw up twice. I think you'll be fine flying to Ohio by yourself." There was a long silence on the phone. Then she hung up on me. She flew out that same night and ended up staying in Columbus for 2 weeks while her father recovered, and I used every single one of those 14 days with a level of efficiency that honestly surprised even me. I hired movers. I found a 1-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes away, signed the lease, and moved my clothes, my books, my grandfather's old drafting tools, my share of the furniture we'd agreed on before she left. We'd actually had a brief, business-like conversation about the couch and the dining table before her flight, which in hindsight tells you she had no idea what was coming, and every remaining trace of myself out of that house. I left one letter on the kitchen counter, printed, not handwritten, because I didn't trust my handwriting not to shake. It explained that I had filed for divorce, that the paperwork was already in motion, and that I would be reachable through my attorney going forward. Then I left my key on top of the letter and drove away for the last time. When Vanessa got back from Ohio and found half her house gone, and that letter waiting for her, she called me 25 times in a single evening. I know it was exactly 25 because I watched the call log climb, sitting in my new apartment on a folding chair I hadn't gotten around to replacing yet, eating cold pad thai out of the container. On the 26th attempt, she finally left a voicemail instead of hanging up, and it was this bizarre, whiplashing thing, 30 seconds of sobbing and begging me me to call her back, then completely unprompted pivoting into calling me a coward and a monster for doing this while she was already going through so much with her father. I didn't call back. I turned my phone face down on the counter and left it there for 2 days. Word apparently traveled fast through her friend group because within about 72 hours I was getting texts from numbers I didn't recognize. Friends of hers, a co-worker of hers I'd met exactly twice, even her hot yoga instructor somehow. All variations on the theme of, how could you abandon your wife while her father was dying? It became very clear very quickly that Vanessa had constructed and distributed a version of events in which I was a cruel, cold man who'd walked out on her during a family medical crisis with no mention whatsoever of an unattended funeral or a Pomeranian's upset stomach. I didn't respond to any of it. I blocked the numbers I could and let my phone sit silent otherwise. My father's brother, my uncle Walter, called me around this time, and it turned out to be one of the more grounding conversations of my life. Walter is 58, runs a small landscaping business outside the city, and has never in his life been shy about an opinion. He told me that he, and basically the entire extended family, my late father's side and my mother's side both, had privately thought for years that Vanessa treated me more like hired help than a husband, that they'd bitten their tongues at holidays watching her order me around to refill her wine or move her car, and that he was, in his exact words, relieved as hell that I was finally getting out. He told me to come to Thanksgiving at his place no matter what, that there would always be a chair for me, married or not, and that meant more to me in that moment than I think he realized. I met with my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Cross, who worked out of a small firm downtown, about a week later. She told me flatly that in the 15 years she'd been practicing, she'd rarely had a client walk in with financial documentation as thorough as mine. Full account histories, appraisal records on the house, a clean paper trail on every joint asset we had. Colorado is an equitable distribution no-fault state, she explained, which meant we didn't need to prove wrongdoing, just divide things fairly, and given how organized I was, she expected the process to take somewhere around 6 months, barring any major disputes. I remember feeling for the first time in months like I had some control over something. Vanessa's mother, Diane, called me not long after that. I almost didn't pick up, but some old habit of politeness toward my in-laws won out. She talked for almost 40 minutes, most of it a kind of meandering plea. Vanessa was devastated. Vanessa loved me. Marriages go through rough patches. Couldn't we at least talk? Wouldn't I consider counseling before doing anything as final as divorce? I let her finish, and then I asked her one question. I asked whether she, personally, would have skipped her mother-in-law's funeral because her dog threw up twice. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I actually checked whether the call had dropped. Then Diane sighed, this deep, tired, resigned sound, and said that Vanessa had always struggled with putting herself in other people's shoes, even as a little girl, but that she hoped I could find it in myself to forgive her anyway. I told her that forgiveness requires the other person to actually recognize what they did wrong, and that as far as I knew, Vanessa still believed staying home with Coco had been the correct decision that day. Diane didn't argue with that. She just said okay, very quietly, and we hung up, and she never called me again after that. Vanessa herself cornered me about 2 weeks later in the parking garage at my office building, which unsettled me more than I want to admit. I never told her where I worked had changed its garage access, and I still don't know exactly how she knew to be there at that specific time. She asked, more like demanded, that we talk, and rather than have that conversation in a concrete stairwell, I suggested a coffee shop nearby, somewhere public, somewhere with other people around as a kind of unspoken insurance policy. We sat across from each other at a little two-top table with our coffees going cold between us, and she tried out a justification for the funeral that I genuinely did not see coming. She said, and I'm going to get this close to exact because it's seared into my memory, that her father could have died, and that's different because your mom was already gone, so me being there or not being there at the funeral didn't actually change anything. I sat with that sentence for a moment, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold, because I understood in that instant that she hadn't just made an error in judgment on one specific terrible morning. She had a whole world view in which her presence at my mother's funeral was functionally optional, because the outcome, my mother being dead, was already fixed. When she then suggested, almost gently, that maybe we should try marriage counseling before doing anything we couldn't undo, I reminded her that I had slept in our guest room for 3 straight months, and she had never once asked me why, never once come in to check on me, never once suggested we look through my mom's old photo albums together, or even said my mother's name to me unprompted in all that time. I told her that a marriage doesn't get repaired retroactively by one coffee shop conversation after the papers are already filed. I left left a $10 bill on the table for my untouched coffee, and walked out. And that was the last real conversation we ever had. The months that followed were not smooth. Vanessa refused to sign the initial paperwork for weeks, forcing delays through her own attorney that felt, to me, purely spiteful. At one point, she had the locks changed on the Aurora house, the house we still jointly owned, despite the fact that I had every legal right to access it during the proceedings, which resulted in an unpleasant call between our two lawyers that cost both of us money we didn't need to spend. She also started posting these vague, mournful things on social media, the kind of post clearly aimed at painting a picture of a wounded, abandoned wife without ever naming specifics. Candles, sad quotes about betrayal. A photo of Coco captioned something about the only one who never left me. A few of her friends liked and commented with heart emojis and messages like, sending you strength, and I had to just let all of it happen without responding, which was its own kind of exhausting. At one point, I found out, through a neighbor who still spoke to me, that Vanessa had parked outside my new apartment complex for several hours on 2 separate evenings, apparently just sitting there. I never confronted her about it directly. I just made a mental note, mentioned it to Renata, and started parking my car in the covered garage instead of on the street. Thanksgiving that year, I went to Walter's place like he'd told me to, and it turned out to be exactly what I needed. His wife, my Aunt Carol, hugged me so hard when I walked in that she nearly knocked the pie I'd brought right out of my hands. Their kids, my cousins, all in their 20s and 30s now, made a point of pulling me into conversations, asking about work, ribbing me gently about my terrible taste in throw pillows in my new apartment. I'd apparently made an ill-advised impulse purchase online that Walter had seen photos of and would not let go. Sitting at that crowded table, surrounded by people who actually wanted me there, who weren't counting the minutes until I could be useful to them again, I remember feeling something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight since October. Mediation started in December and dragged into January. Vanessa came into the first session asking for more than half of everything, arguing through her attorney that she had sacrificed her career for our marriage. I nearly laughed out loud at that and had to actually stop myself because Vanessa had worked the exact same marketing job at the exact same mid-sized ad agency for the entire 6 years we'd been together, had gotten 2 promotions during that time, and had never once so much as mentioned taking time off, let alone actually doing it. When the mediator, a very patient man named Gerald, who I imagine has seen every flavor of divorce claim imaginable, asked for documentation supporting the sacrifice narrative, Vanessa's side had nothing to produce. No unpaid leave, no reduced hours, no declined promotions. By the January session, with that leverage gone, she agreed to a much more reasonable split. She kept the house in Aurora since she genuinely couldn't afford to buy me out and wanted to stay near her friend group, and kept her car. I kept my car, my full retirement account, and we split our joint savings roughly down the middle. It wasn't a perfectly even outcome given what I'd put into the down payment on that house originally, but Renata told me honestly that fighting harder for more would have cost more in legal fees than I'd actually gain, and I trusted her judgment enough to let it go. I ran into one of Vanessa's yoga friends at a grocery store in January, a woman named Priya, who I'd met a handful of times at group dinners over the years, always pleasant enough in passing. She recognized me in the cereal aisle, of all places, and marched right up to me, visibly furious, and told me I was a coward for abandoning Vanessa while her father was in the hospital. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked her calmly whether she knew that Vanessa had skipped my mother's funeral because our dog threw up twice that morning. Priya's whole face changed. She actually took a step back, like the question had physically pushed her. She admitted quietly that she'd only ever heard Vanessa's version of what happened between us, and she mumbled something about needing to get going and left her cart half abandoned in the aisle. I don't know if that changed her opinion of Vanessa permanently, or if Vanessa smoothed it back over later, and honestly, by that point, I found that I genuinely didn't care either way. The divorce was finalized in March, almost exactly 6 months to the day after my mother's funeral, which felt less like a coincidence and more like some kind of grim fitting symmetry. I picked up the final paperwork from Renata's office on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and instead of going home, I drove straight to the cemetery where my mother is buried. I sat on the grass next to her headstone for a long time, telling her, out loud, embarrassingly, like she could actually hear me, that it was over, that I'd finally done what I think some part of me had known needed doing for years, that I was sorry it took her death to make me see it clearly. I told her I hoped she'd be proud of this too, not just of the man I'd become before, but of the decision I'd finally made to stop shrinking myself down to fit inside someone else's convenience. The months after that were, honestly, some of the most quietly healing of my adult life. In April, I joined a local grief support group that met on Wednesday evenings in the basement of a community center, a small circle of maybe 10 people who'd all lost someone significant in the past year or two. I was hesitant walking in the first time, self-conscious in that specific male way about admitting I needed help processing feelings, but by the third session I found I actually looked forward to it, to being around people who understood without needing an explanation why some random Tuesday might hit you sideways with grief for no obvious reason. In May, Walter helped me move again, this time into a bigger 2-bedroom apartment I could actually afford comfortably on my own income, no longer having to account for anyone else's spending habits. He drove up with his truck and, unprompted, brought along 2 boxes of my mother's old photo albums that he'd apparently been keeping in his garage since her house was sold. Photos going back to when she and my dad were newly married, photos of her pregnant with me, photos from her decades of teaching 3rd grade, kids' handmade cards taped into the margins. We spent an entire Saturday afternoon going through them together, him telling me stories about her I'd never heard, about their childhood, about the year she'd talked their whole family into driving to see the Grand Canyon in a car with no air conditioning, and I laughed more that day than I think I had in the previous year combined. In July, around what would have been my mother's 62nd birthday, I took a personal day off work and volunteered at a cancer support center downtown, the kind of place that helps patients and families navigate appointments and just offers somewhere to sit and not be alone. It felt like the right way to mark the day, doing something in the spirit of who she'd been, rather than just sitting with the absence of her. By August, roughly 6 months after the divorce was finalized, and just under a year after the funeral that started all of it, I can honestly say I've found something like peace. I go to the gym 4 mornings a week now, something I never had the energy or the headspace for during my marriage. I have dinner with Walter and Carol most Sundays, a standing tradition none of us have missed in months. I still go to the grief group occasionally, though less often now, mostly to support newer members the way people supported me when I first walked in. I think about my mother every day, but it doesn't hollow me out the way it used to. It feels more like carrying her with me than being crushed under the loss of her. And I think, genuinely, that I've become someone she would recognize as the person she told the hospice nurse she was proud of, someone who finally understood, even if it took losing her to learn it, exactly what showing up for the people who matter is actually worth, and exactly what it costs you when you stay with someone who never learned that lesson at all. There's a coda to this story I've hesitated to include, but I think it matters. In late July, right around the anniversary of my mother's birthday, I got a message request on social media from an account I didn't recognize at first. Turned out to be Vanessa's cousin, a woman named Renee I'd met maybe twice at holiday gatherings over the years, always on the periphery of things. She wasn't reaching out to relitigate anything or take sides. She said she'd heard some version of what happened from family gossip over the year, and just wanted to tell me quietly that she was sorry for what I went through, and that she hoped I was doing okay. It was such a small, unremarkable message, but it caught me off guard in a way I didn't expect, mostly because it was the first time in almost a year that someone from that side of the family had reached out without wanting something from me. I wrote back a short, polite thank you and left it at that, but it stuck with me for days afterward. This small, unexpected kindness from someone who had no obligation to offer it. I heard through the grapevine that still occasionally reaches me despite my best efforts to disconnect from it, that Vanessa is dating someone new now, a guy from her yoga studio, and that Coco is apparently still doing just fine, spoiled as ever. I felt strangely little when I heard that news. Not bitterness, not longing, just a kind of distant, almost clinical acknowledgement that her life has continued on its own trajectory, separate from mine, exactly the way it should. I used to think that ending a marriage would feel like losing a limb, like something permanently missing that I'd have to learn to live around for the rest of my life. What I've actually found is closer to the opposite. It feels like I spent 3 years slowly, quietly, shrinking myself to fit into a space that was never built to hold the whole of who I am, and getting out simply gave that space back to me. I've started dating again recently, nothing serious, mostly just dinners and coffee here and there, and I've noticed myself paying attention to small things I never used to think to watch for. How someone reacts when I mention my mom, whether they ask follow-up questions about her, or just nod and move the conversation along, whether they seem genuinely curious about the people I love or just tolerant of hearing about them. It's a strange kind of vigilance to carry into new relationships, but I don't think it's an unhealthy one. I think it's just what happens when you've learned the hard way, exactly what the absence of that curiosity costs you. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I've turned it over in my head more times than I can count trying to find one, I think it's something like this. The way someone treats you during the ordinary, low-stakes moments of a relationship, a rescheduled hair appointment, an inconvenient errand, a minor disruption to their routine, will eventually show up, amplified, in the moments that actually matter. Vanessa never once, in 6 years, showed me that she was capable of putting someone else's need ahead of her own comfort, not in any of the small ways that might have warned me. And so when the biggest test of our marriage arrived, on that cold October Saturday with my mother's casket waiting at the front of a church, she failed it exactly the way every smaller test before it had predicted she would. I just hadn't been paying close enough attention to see the pattern until grief forced my eyes open. My mother spent 30 years teaching 8-year-olds, and if there's one thing I remember her saying to me more than almost anything else growing up, it's that character is what you do when nobody important is watching and nothing is at stake. How you treat the waiter, how you treat the neighbor's dog, how you treat the person who can do nothing for you. I think about that a lot now, turning it over from the other direction. Character Character is also what you do when everything is at stake, and the person who needs you is the one who can no longer do anything for you at all because they're gone. Vanessa failed that test on a Saturday morning in October, and it took me 3 months to admit to myself what that failure actually meant, and it took 6 more months of paperwork and cold coffee and family phone calls to finally walk all the way out the door it had opened. But I walked out, and on the other side of that door, slowly, month by month, I built something that finally looks and feels like a life I actually chose, instead of one I was just quietly enduring. My mother would have liked that, I think. She always did prefer endings where somebody finally stood up for themselves.